For a long time, people have grown used to seeing public figures push back against criticism. They challenge stories they believe are unfair. They argue with institutions that feel distant and powerful. Over time, this back and forth becomes part of the background noise of modern fame. It is expected, it is familiar, but every so often, a situation appears that feels different, not louder, not more dramatic, just heavier. The kind of moment where even careful observers pause and sense that something has shifted. Over the past few days, quiet discussion has been spreading through fashion circles, legal communities, and online commentary spaces. It did not begin with a press conference. It did not arrive through a dramatic announcement. Instead, it surfaced through small signals: a legal filing here, a canceled appearance there, a noticeable silence where statements are usually quick to arrive. Together, these details have led many people to ask whether a long-simmering relationship between influence and privilege has reached a breaking point. At the center of these conversations is a well-known public figure, someone whose image has been carefully built through appearances, projects, and media partnerships. For years, that image has relied heavily on fashion. Clothing has not just been decoration, it has been part of the message. Each appearance has carried meaning. Each outfit has been analyzed, praised, and circulated. In that world, fashion is not a side note, it is a form of language. What makes this moment unusual is not that a disagreement exists. Disagreements happen every day. What has drawn attention is the identity of the other party involved. This is not a tabloid outlet. It is not a distant relative. It is not an online critic. According to unconfirmed but widely discussed legal commentary, the dispute involves one of the most powerful luxury fashion houses in the world, a company known less for public arguments and more for quiet enforcement of its interests. No official ruling has been made. No courtroom drama has played out in public. Yet the discussion continues to grow, fueled by the idea that this is not just about clothing or money. It is about boundaries. It is about what happens when personal branding meets corporate control. And it is about why this story, despite careful language and limited confirmation, refuses to fade from view. Understand why this situation feels so different. It helps to look back at how the relationship between celebrity and luxury fashion usually works. At the highest levels, these relationships are built on trust. Designers and fashion houses invest heavily in image. They rely on selected individuals to represent their work in a way that adds value rather than risk. In return, public figures receive access to clothing that few people in the world will ever touch. Sometimes items are loaned. Sometimes they are purchased. Sometimes arrangements are informal, guided by reputation rather than paperwork. This system works because everyone understands the unspoken rules. A garment worn publicly becomes part of the brand's story. Once that story is told, it cannot be undone. Even if the item is returned, its value has changed. That is why fashion houses are careful. That is why relationships are managed quietly and closely. According to public discussion surrounding the current situation, concerns began to form over a long period of time. Not days, not weeks, months. Some commentators suggest that patterns were noticed, not just isolated incidents. Repeated transactions, repeated returns, each one on its own might have appeared harmless. Together, they began to raise questions. Questions about intention, questions about process, questions about whether the usual assumptions still applied. It is important to be clear. These discussions are based on commentary surrounding a legal claim. They have not been proven in court. No final judgment exists. Still, the level of detail being discussed has caught attention. Numbers have been mentioned, timeframes have been suggested, and while none of this has been officially confirmed beyond filings, the specificity alone has fueled curiosity. At the center of the discussion is the idea of wardrobing, a practice known within retail but rarely associated with high-profile luxury clients. The term describes purchasing items, using them, and then returning them as if they were unused. In everyday retail, stores guard against this quietly. In luxury fashion, where items carry symbolic value beyond price, the implications are far more serious. According to analysis circulating among legal observers, the claim suggests that this practice was not accidental. It was not the result of confusion or poor communication. Instead, it is described as systematic. Again, this remains an allegation, not a confirmed fact. But the way it is being framed has shifted the conversation from simple customer service disputes to questions about intent and responsibility. What makes the discussion more complex is the involvement of teams. Public figures at this level rarely act alone. Assistants handle logistics, stylists coordinate looks, managers approve expenses. This creates layers of distance between decision and action. It also creates ambiguity. If something goes wrong, who is responsible? The individual, the staff, the system itself? Observers note that this ambiguity may be part of why the story has taken so long to surface. Patterns are harder to see when actions are spread across people and time. A single return is forgettable. Dozens, if they occurred, would not be. If the claims are accurate, the decision to allow this pattern to continue without immediate confrontation suggests that evidence was being gathered quietly rather than addressed loudly. This is where the tone of the situation appears to change. Luxury brands are known for patience. They rarely rush. They document. They observe. When they act, it is usually with confidence that their position is secure. The discussions around this case suggest that any legal action was not impulsive. It was prepared. Commentary has also focused on the nature of the evidence being discussed. Luxury fashion houses maintain strict quality control processes. Returned items are inspected carefully. This is not simply to protect resale value. It is to protect brand integrity. In high-end garments, even subtle signs of wear can change how an item is classified. Some analysts have pointed to references in the claim to detailed inspection methods. Again, this is unconfirmed outside legal filings, but the idea that garments are examined at a microscopic level is not unusual in couture houses. Fabrics are tested, fibers are analyzed, scents and residues are noted. These processes exist precisely because appearance alone can be misleading. The discussion becomes more unsettling when commentators mention biological traces, not because such traces are shocking, but because they are difficult to explain away. Makeup residue, skin contact, hair fibers. These are the kinds of details that complicate defenses based on mistake or misunderstanding. Still, it must be stressed that these are claims under discussion, not established facts. As the conversation moved beyond the physical garments, attention shifted to behavior, not what was worn, but how interactions unfolded. In retail, particularly at luxury levels, disputes are handled discreetly. Voices are kept low. Managers are trained to de-escalate. That is why allegations of recorded confrontations, if true, have drawn such strong reactions. According to commentary surrounding the filing, there may be audio evidence related to a disputed return. The existence of such recordings has not been independently confirmed, but the suggestion alone raises questions about why a store manager would feel the need to document an interaction. Recording is not standard practice unless a situation is perceived as volatile or potentially litigious. If such recordings exist, they would not simply capture words. They would capture tone, attitude, power dynamics. These elements matter in legal contexts because they speak to intent and credibility. Still, until such evidence is presented in court, it remains part of discussion rather than conclusion. Another element that has expanded the scope of the story is the involvement of media production. Public figures often invite cameras into their homes and workplaces. They document their lives for projects meant to shape public perception. This creates vast amounts of unused footage, background conversations, offhand remarks, moments not intended for broadcast. Commentators have suggested that some of this footage may now be relevant. If discussions about clothing, returns, or strategy were captured unintentionally, they could complicate narratives built after the fact. Again, this remains speculative. No footage has been released. No official confirmation has been made. But the idea that private planning could collide with legal scrutiny has added another layer of tension. Financial aspects have also entered the discussion. Luxury clothing is expensive. How it is purchased, categorized, and accounted for matters. When clothing is used for professional appearances, it may be classified as a business expense. If items are returned, accounting records must reflect that change. Failure to do so can raise compliance questions. Some legal commentators have raised hypothetical concerns about tax implications. These discussions are careful to note that no government agency has announced any investigation. However, the mere possibility of discrepancies has broadened the conversation from a civil dispute to a matter of regulatory interest. This shift alone can change how seriously a situation is taken. As these discussions unfolded, reactions within the fashion industry have reportedly been swift but quiet. Invitations change, relationships cool. Success narrows, fashion operates on networks of trust. When that trust is questioned, even indirectly, consequences can ripple outward without public explanation. There has been talk, unconfirmed but persistent, about exclusion from major events. In fashion, these events are not just parties, they are platforms. Being absent sends a message, even when no reason is given. Observers note that silence often speaks louder than statements in these spaces. Another dimension of the story involves personal relationships. In industries where alliances are strategic, loyalty has limits. When risk appears, individuals reassess. Commentary has suggested that former associates may be cooperating with inquiries to protect their own interests. This is not unusual. it is how systems respond to uncertainty. If true, such cooperation would challenge narratives that rely on isolation or scapegoating. It would suggest shared knowledge, shared participation, or at least shared awareness. Again, these are discussions, not determinations. What has perhaps resonated most with the public is not the legal complexity, but the symbolic meaning. The idea that status can override rules has always been uncomfortable. When that idea appears to be tested, people pay attention, not because they seek downfall, but because they seek clarity. Luxury brands do not operate on admiration alone. They operate on control. They guard their symbols fiercely. When they act, it is often to reinforce the message that access is conditional, not guaranteed. If this case proceeds as discussed, it may become a reference point for future relationships between fashion houses and public figures. Some industry insiders have already spoken anonymously about new protocols, stricter loan agreements, larger deposits, reduced informal trust. These changes would not be framed as punishment, but as protection. Still, they would affect many people beyond the central figure in this story. As time passes, the lack of definitive resolution keeps the discussion alive. No dramatic courtroom scenes have emerged. No sweeping statements have clarified everything. Instead, there is waiting for filings, waiting for responses, waiting to see whether this remains a contained dispute or becomes something larger. This is why the story continues, not because of scandal, but because of uncertainty. Each new detail raises more questions than answers. Each silence invites interpretation, and in the absence of confirmation, analysis fills the space. In moments like this, it is tempting to rush to conclusions, but careful observers know better. Legal processes move slowly. Reputations shift quietly before they break loudly. What matters now is not what people assume, but what can be demonstrated. As this situation develops, it serves as a reminder of how fragile constructed images can be, how systems built on trust depend on consistent behavior, and how, when boundaries are tested, even the most polished surfaces can show strain. For now, all that exists is discussion, allegations without verdicts, patterns without confirmation, reactions without explanation. Whether this story fades or deepens will depend on what comes next and on whether clarity replaces speculation. Until then, the unease remains, not explosive, not dramatic, just present, the kind that lingers, quietly reshaping expectations long before anyone admits that something has changed. To understand why this discussion has taken on such weight, it helps to look at how the situation was shaped long before any legal language appeared in public conversation. The figure at the center of this story did not arrive suddenly. Her presence was built over years, through carefully chosen roles, partnerships, and moments that were meant to signal stability and influence. Fashion played a steady role in that rise, not as decoration, but as a tool that helped frame her as modern, controlled, and globally relevant. In the early stages, her relationship with luxury brands appeared typical for someone of her visibility. Designers were eager to be seen on her. Stylists competed to place her in standout pieces. Each appearance created images that traveled far beyond the event itself. Photographs circulated online, in print, and across international outlets. The clothing became part of a larger narrative about confidence, independence, and reinvention. At first, there was little reason for anyone to question how those looks were assembled. In high-profile circles, it is common for garments to be loaned for single appearances. In other cases, items are purchased outright. The public rarely knows which arrangement applies, and usually it does not matter. What matters is the image that remains once the moment has passed. Over time, however, subtle changes began to appear. According to industry observers, there were signs that the pace of wardrobe turnover was unusually high. New pieces appeared frequently, sometimes within short windows. Each look seemed carefully timed to coincide with public-facing moments, whether related to media projects, appearances, or announcements. None of this was improper on its own. It simply reflected an understanding of how visibility works. Behind the scenes, though, luxury houses operate with detailed records. Purchases are logged, returns are tracked, patterns are noticed, even when no one comments on them aloud. A return here or there does not raise concern. High-end clothing can be rejected for fit or comfort, but when returns begin to align too closely with high-profile use, questions naturally follow. According to public discussion of the claim, this alignment is what first drew attention. Items were reportedly returned shortly after major appearances, often described as unworn or unsuitable. Again, this is based on commentary around a filing, not confirmed findings. Still, it suggests that someone was looking closely enough to notice timing, not just transactions. As months passed, the relationship between the public figure's team and certain boutiques became more procedural. Interactions that were once casual reportedly grew formal. Staff followed policy carefully. Documentation increased. This shift is not dramatic when it happens, but it signals a change in trust. Luxury brands rarely confront clients directly unless they are certain of their position. Another important layer of context involves the team surrounding the central figure. Stylists, assistants, and managers act as intermediaries. They handle purchases, coordinate returns, and manage schedules. This creates a buffer that can protect principals from direct scrutiny, but it can also blur accountability. When questions arise, responsibility can appear diffuse. Commentators have noted that this diffusion may have delayed any direct action. If concerns existed, they would need to be traced through multiple hands. Receipts would need to be matched to appearances. Internal reviews would need to confirm whether policies were being respected. This takes time, especially when discretion is valued. During this period, public perception remained largely unchanged. The figure continued to appear polished. Coverage remained focused on her projects and messaging. Fashion commentary stayed positive. Nothing outward suggested tension. This contrast between public calm and private review is part of what now makes the situation feel unsettling. It is also worth noting the cultural moment in which this unfolded. Luxury brands have become more cautious in recent years. Social media amplifies both success and controversy. A single misstep can travel fast and damage long-standing reputations. As a result, companies have tightened controls and become less willing to rely on informal arrangements. Against this backdrop, any pattern that hinted at misuse would be taken seriously, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Protecting brand value is not optional for these companies. It is central to their survival. By the time legal language entered the conversation, the groundwork had likely already been laid. Observers suggest that what appears sudden to the public may have been the result of long internal deliberation. If true, that would explain the confidence implied by the claims being discussed. This is where the story moves from background to uncertainty. Once formal steps are taken, relationships change permanently. Even if allegations are later softened or resolved, the trust that existed before cannot simply be restored. This is the moment where quiet concern turns into open discussion. And it is at this point that many people, both inside and outside the industry, began asking the same question. How did something so controlled reach a stage where it could no longer be handled privately? At this point, many people started asking questions, not because answers were available, but because the situation no longer felt contained. What had once appeared as a series of ordinary transactions now seemed to sit within a larger pattern that demanded explanation. Observers were no longer focused only on what may or may not have happened, but on how such a situation could develop without earlier intervention. One of the first questions raised in public commentary was about awareness. Who knew what and when did they know it? In environments where assistants and intermediaries manage day-to-day logistics, principals often operate at a distance from details. This distance can be practical, but it can also create blind spots. Some discussions suggest that this structure may have played a role in allowing questionable practices, if they occurred, to continue longer than expected. Another question centered on intent. Luxury retail disputes often hinge on whether an action was accidental or deliberate. A sizing issue is accidental. A defect can be accidental, but repeated outcomes that benefit one party at the expense of another invite scrutiny, according to analysts Rev. Viewing the claim, the language used points toward concerns about planning rather than mistake. That distinction matters, especially in civil disputes where intent shapes liability. As the conversation widened, attention turned to the mechanics of returns themselves. In ordinary retail, returns are straightforward. In luxury environments, they are anything but. Items are inspected under controlled conditions. Stitching is examined. Fabric is checked for stress. Even minor signs of wear can alter an item's classification. This process exists because the value of luxury clothing is tied to its condition and exclusivity. Public discussion has suggested that returned items in this case were initially presented as unused. That claim, if disputed, raises the issue of verification. How does a brand determine whether an item has been worn if visible tags remain attached? The answer lies in inspection methods that are rarely discussed outside industry circles. These methods are technical, quiet, and difficult to argue against once documented. This is where commentary began to shift from curiosity to unease, not because of sensational details, but because of the implications. If a brand asserts that it can demonstrate use despite outward appearances, then defenses based on misunderstanding weaken. Again, this remains within the realm of allegation, but the logic of the claim has been enough to hold attention. Another layer of questioning involved communication. If concerns existed, were they ever raised informally? Did staff attempt to clarify policies? Did managers signal discomfort before matters escalated? These questions are difficult to answer without internal records, which are not public. Still, their absence fuels speculation about how conflicts are managed when power imbalances exist. There's also the matter of reputation management. Public figures are often shielded from immediate consequences because brands fear backlash. Speaking up can be risky. Silence in the short term feels safer, but silence can also be interpreted as consent. When that balance tips, the response can be firm and final. As these ideas circulated, some commentators pointed out that the story is not just about one person or one brand. It reflects a broader tension between influence and accountability. In systems built on image, rules can blur. When rules blur too far, they must eventually be redrawn. Financial questions added further complexity. High-value clothing transactions intersect with accounting practices. How purchases are categorized matters. If items are intended for professional use, they may be treated differently than personal purchases. Returns complicate this picture. Records must be adjusted. Timing matters. Any mismatch, even accidental, can raise compliance questions. It is important to stress that no authority has announced wrongdoing in this area. These are hypothetical concerns raised by analysts, not confirmed issues. Still, the possibility alone has expanded the scope of interest. What began as a fashion dispute now touches on governance and oversight. As discussion continued, some voices urged caution. They reminded audiences that allegations are not verdicts, that legal claims often present the strongest possible framing for one side, that defenses exist, even when they are not yet visible. This perspective has helped temper some of the more extreme speculation. Yet even with caution, the questions remain. Why now? Why this brand? Why such detailed claims? These questions persist because they point to underlying dynamics rather than surface events. What followed only added to the confusion. Instead of clarity, there was quiet, no immediate denial, no detailed explanation, just a pause that allowed interpretation to fill the gap. In modern media cycles, silence rarely stops discussion, it redirects it. As days passed, the narrative settled into a pattern of analysis rather than reaction. People began connecting dots, not to accuse, but to understand. And in that process, the story moved beyond the specifics of clothing and returns into something broader, something about how systems respond when informal trust breaks down. This is the stage where stories either fade or deepen, and in this case, all signs suggested that the discussion was far from over. This is where the situation began to change in tone, not because new facts were confirmed, but because repeated elements started to form a recognizable shape. When observers stepped back and looked at the discussion as a whole, certain patterns appeared difficult to ignore. These patterns did not rely on one dramatic claim. They relied on consistency over time. One pattern involved timing. According to public commentary, items connected to the dispute often appeared during moments of high visibility: red carpets, formal appearances, promotional events. These were not casual outings. They were moments when images would be widely shared and archived, in the fascio. In world, this matters because the value of exposure is highest when attention peaks. Another pattern involved speed. Items were reportedly returned quickly after these moments passed. In isolation, quick returns can be explained. Travel schedules change, styling decisions are revised, but when speed aligns repeatedly with public use, it draws attention to intent. Again, this is an interpretation offered by analysts, not a conclusion reached by a court. There was also a pattern in how interactions were described. Commentary suggests that returns followed similar scripts, similar explanations, similar assurances. Consistency can be a sign of professionalism. It can also be a sign of rehearsed process. Which interpretation applies depends on evidence that has not yet been fully examined publicly. As these patterns were discussed, focus shifted toward documentation. Luxury brands are meticulous record keepers. Every transaction leaves a trail: receipts, timestamps, internal notes. When patterns emerge, they can be demonstrated through data rather than opinion. This is one reason legal observers have taken the claim seriously, even while acknowledging its unproven status. The discussion around inspection methods returned as well. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were methodical. Fabric does not forget contact. Scents linger. Fibers shift. These are not moral judgments. They are physical realities. If inspection reports exist, they would speak quietly but clearly. Another emerging pattern involved escalation. Early returns, according to commentary, were accepted. Later ones were questioned. Eventually, at least one return was reportedly refused. This progression suggests a threshold was crossed. brands do not usually refuse returns lightly, especially when clients are influential. Refusal signals that internal confidence has been reached. At this stage, behavioral details became part of the conversation, not just what happened, but how it happened. Analysts discussed reports of tense interactions, raised voices, assertive language. These descriptions remain unverified, but they matter because they speak to power dynamics. How individuals behave when challenged often shapes how disputes are remembered. It was also during this phase that discussions of recorded material gained traction. The idea that audio might exist is unsettling not because of content, but because of permanence. Spoken words fade, recordings endure. If such material exists, it would remove ambiguity from certain exchanges. Still, until presented, it remains a point of speculation. Media involvement added another layer. When cameras are present, reality and performance overlap. People speak differently, they act differently. Offhand remarks can take on new meaning when replayed. Commentary suggested that behind-the-scenes footage could complicate public narratives by revealing planning rather than spontaneity. Financial patterns were also examined more closely. Not just totals, but methods, which accounts were used, how expenses were categorized, whether refunds aligned with accounting adjustments. These details matter because they connect individual actions to institutional responsibility. They also introduce third parties into the story, expanding its reach. As these patterns were discussed, reactions within the industry reportedly became more cautious. Invitations slowed, collaborations paused. This is not unusual. Industries often wait for clarity before committing. Silence can be a form of risk management. What made this phase particularly tense was the absence of resolution. Patterns without answers create discomfort. They suggest momentum without direction. Observers could sense that something was building, even if they could not yet see where it would land. This accumulation of detail changed how the story was perceived. It was no longer about a single dispute. It was about whether a way of operating had reached its limits, whether informal privilege had collided with formal systems. And as more people recognized these patterns, attention shifted again, this time toward how the wider public, the media, and institutions might respond once awareness spread beyond industry circles. Once the discussion moved beyond industry circles, the response began to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. This was not a moment of public outrage or mass condemnation. Instead, it unfolded through quiet adjustments. Mentions became cautious, coverage slowed, questions replaced praise. In many ways, this kind of response is more telling than loud criticism. Media outlets that usually track fashion and celebrity activity closely began to change their tone. Stories that once focused on style choices started to emphasize context. Appearances were noted without analysis. In some cases, they were not noted at all. This was not an organized decision, but a collective instinct to wait. When uncertainty grows, institutions often pause rather than risk. Being wronged. Public commentary followed a similar pattern. Online discussions did not explode overnight. They grew slowly, fed by curiosity rather than anger. Viewers shared observations. They compared timelines. They asked why certain events were missing familiar faces. Much of this conversation was careful to avoid claims, instead framing thoughts as questions. This caution reflects an understanding that speculation carries consequences. Within institutional spaces, reactions were reportedly even quieter. Fashion houses are interconnected. They share suppliers, advertisers, and platforms. When one brand signals discomfort, others notice. According to unconfirmed industry chatter, informal conversations began to circulate about tightening protocols. Lending policies were reviewed. Approval chains became more rigid. None of this was announced publicly, but its effects were felt. High-profile events played a role in this shift. Invitations are a form of endorsement. Being included suggests confidence. Being excluded suggests uncertainty. When certain names failed to appear on guest lists where they were once expected, observers took note. No explanation was offered. None was required. In these spaces, absence communicates enough. Another institutional response involved distancing. Media partners, sponsors, and collaborators are sensitive to reputational risk. When questions arise, even without answers, they reassess. This does not always lead to termination. More often, it leads to delay. Projects slow. Decisions are postponed. This creates a quiet but real impact. Legal observers have pointed out that such reactions are not judgments. They are precautions. Institutions act to protect themselves, not to assign blame. Still, these precautions shape outcomes. They influence momentum. They affect visibility. Over time, they can redefine a public figure's position without a single formal statement. Public sentiment reflected this ambiguity. Many people expressed discomfort with rushing to conclusions. Others noted that silence from those involved left space for interpretation. Some defended the idea that complex systems can fail without malicious intent. Others argued that patterns deserve scrutiny regardless of status. The conversation remained measured, but it did not fade. What became clear during this phase was that the story had entered a holding pattern. No new confirmed information emerged, yet interest persisted. Each small development was examined closely. Each non-development was noted. This kind of attention can be exhausting, but it also signals significance. Institutions are built to withstand scrutiny. Public figures are built to manage perception. When both face uncertainty at the same time, the resulting tension is difficult to resolve quickly. That tension is what now defines this situation. And it is also what explains why, despite the lack of definitive answers, the story continues to occupy space in public consciousness. This is why the discussion has not faded, even as days pass without dramatic updates. Stories like this continue not because of noise, but because of what they represent. They sit at the intersection of influence, accountability, and systems that usually operate out of view. When those systems are briefly exposed, even indirectly, people keep watching. One reason the story endures is its unfinished nature. There has been no clear denial that addresses every question. There has been no confirmation that settles the matter either. Instead, there is a gap. In that gap, observers return to the same core uncertainty. Was this simply a misunderstanding that grew larger than it should have, or was it the result of a way of operating that finally met resistance? Another reason is the broader implication for public figures who rely on branding as currency. Clothing, appearances, and associations are not superficial at this level. They are strategic assets. If access to those assets becomes conditional in new ways, it changes how visibility is managed. People who watch these systems understand that shifts at the top eventually shape expectations everywhere else. The story also continues because it challenges assumptions about protection. For a long time, there has been a belief that certain individuals exist above ordinary constraints. That belief is rarely tested openly. When it appears to be questioned, even through unproven claims, it unsettles audiences, not because they want to see anyone fall, but because it forces a reassessment of how power actually works. Legal ambiguity plays its role as well. Civil disputes move slowly. They unfold through documents rather than speeches. This pace frustrates those who expect immediate clarity, but it also sustains attention. Each filing becomes a potential signal. Each delay becomes meaningful. Silence itself becomes part of the narrative. There is also a human element that keeps people engaged. Observers are not only analyzing actions, are imagining pressure, how it feels to be questioned by systems that do not bend easily, how it feels when familiar privileges no longer guarantee smooth outcomes. These reflections are quiet, but they resonate. Industry insiders have suggested that regardless of outcome, consequences are already in motion. Relationships altered by doubt do not always return to their previous form. Even if matters are resolved privately, the memory of uncertainty lingers. That memory influences future decisions in subtle ways. What makes this situation especially lasting is that it does not rely on a single revelation. It unfolds through accumulation, small changes, adjustments in tone, shifts in access. Together, these elements tell a story of recalibration rather than collapse. And that is why people continue to watch, not for spectacle, but for direction. They are waiting to see what this moment signals about the future of influence, discretion, and trust in spaces where image has always been carefully protected. As this story settles into its current pause, what remains is not certainty, but perspective. Moments like this rarely end with a single clear answer that satisfies everyone. More often, they leave behind lessons that only become visible with time. The most important of those lessons may be about how fragile, carefully managed narratives can be when they come into contact with systems that operate quietly and methodically. There is a tendency, especially in long-running public stories, to look for villains and victories, but this situation resists that framing. At its core, it is still a discussion shaped by claims, responses, and unanswered questions. No final judgment has been reached. No comprehensive account has been confirmed. What exists instead is a reminder that influence does not eliminate structure, and visibility does not erase rules. For the public figure involved, this period likely feels suspended. Public life rarely allows for true privacy, but uncertainty creates a different kind of exposure. Every appearance is read for meaning. Every silence is interpreted. Even neutral actions can be seen as signals. This is not unique, but it is intensified when trust has been called into question, even indirectly. For institutions, the moment reinforces why caution exists in the first place. Systems built on prestige depend on predictability. When unpredictability appears, the response is not emotional, it is procedural. Policies are reviewed, boundaries are reinforced. This is how organizations protect themselves without spectacle. For the audience, the story offers something quieter but lasting. It invites reflection on how much of what we see is performance, and how much is supported by unseen agreements. It reminds us that what looks effortless often rests on complex arrangements that require care on all sides. Whether this specific dispute resolves privately or continues publicly, its broader impact is already present. Conversations have changed, assumptions have softened, expectations have adjusted. These shifts do not need announcements to be real. They are felt in decisions made behind closed doors. In the end, the story persists not because of scandal, but because of restraint, because no one has rushed to declare victory or defeat, because the outcome, whatever it may be, will likely arrive quietly rather than dramatically, and because in that quiet, people recognize something familiar, the slow recalibration of power, trust, and accountability. That is why attention remains, not to watch something explode, but to see how it settles.